Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Fry. On this week's special midweek pod, Journal of Commerce staff writer Russell Hixson is talking to Mike Holden, the Vice President of Policy and Chief Economist for the Business Council of Alberta, about the recent rejection of the Keystone XL pipeline project and what the future holds for the Alberta economy. Holden said while rejection of the pipeline by President Joe Biden wasn't a surprise, it was a disappointment for Albertans and the various industries in the province tied to pipeline development. He also pointed out Alberta has endured, as he put it, punch after punch, given multiple oil price crashes and the COVID-19 pandemic, along with the Keystone cancellation. Holden said there are still avenues for Alberta to take advantage of their resource assets, such as attracting private capital to the province and communicating Alberta's successes in moving towards sustainability and a low-carbon future. Federal support for the province and for projects similar to Keystone would also boost confidence. He has a lot more to say about the Keystone situation and Alberta's prospects in 2021 and beyond. So without any further ado, here's Russell's interview.
Welcome, Michael, to the Construction Record Podcast. I spent a lot of time last week covering the Keystone XL decision. There's been a lot of doom and gloom in the construction industry. Jason Kenney had a lot to say about this. A lot of people are very frustrated and very disappointed. I was just wondering if you could kind of give me what your reaction was to hearing this. And I know it seemed to be the Biden administration was pretty clear, I think, early on that they were going to do this. So I don't think it was that shocking, but I'm just curious kind of what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think it was disappointing for everybody in Alberta. It was disappointing for the energy sector. It wasn't a complete shock, as you said. President Biden had signaled that this was something he was going to be doing right from the outset. So I think a lot of people were hoping that he would change his mind at some point, or that the Alberta government or the Canadian government could provide reasonable arguments that would allow him to change his mind. But none of those things happened, and so we are here where we are today. So it's disappointing for sure, but like you said, it's not completely unexpected.
There's been a lot of talk in the last few years about Alberta's economy. It's just faced a lot of challenges. Can you give people kind of an idea of where we're at now?
Sure. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. The provincial economy's had a number of challenges, and it seems to keep on getting hit. So people who are living here in Alberta just keep seeing, punch after punch. And it really started in 2014, 2015 with the first oil price crash. And that really hit the province hard, and it took 2 or 3 years after that for the province to recover, and it didn't actually recover. It never actually got GDP back up to where it had been prior to the crash. And then at the beginning of 2020, there was the oil price crash then with the OPEC and Russia conflict, and then we saw COVID hit, and so the COVID component of that is the same as it was every place else, but in across Canada and around the world. But in a sense, Alberta got hit when it was still reeling from those previous punches, and so that's been so that the province started out in a relatively weak position, and so it's just the bad news just seems to keep piling on.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people thought, major projects like Keystone XL could help give it a bit of a boost. What do you see the future of the kind of oil and gas industry in Alberta, in the context of a decision like this? Do you think we'll see more major projects go ahead in Alberta's oil and gas sector, or may they be second thought?
Well, I think it depends. It's a complicated question, first of all, and it depends first of all on the nature of the projects. I think that there's a lot of there's still the natural gas, the Nova gas pipeline project is still underway. Trans Mountain is still being built, and there are a number of wind and solar projects. There is a significant potential for carbon capture and storage investment, depending on if the province gets a lot of federal government support to help sort of push those projects into an economically viable territory. So there are potential investments still to come in the oil and gas sector, but I think a lot of it really depends on whether or not we can attract private capital to Alberta. And so a lot of, because of so much focus on climate change and focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions or achieving net zero by 2050 in Canada, for a lot of people, they're not sure whether there's a future for the oil and gas sector in doing that. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about it. I think there is, I believe that there is a future for it, but it has to be a low carbon future. And so creating the enabling environment that we need to attract those kinds of investments, find alternative uses for fuels, and innovation and technological development in the energy sector is what we need in order to make use of these assets. Because, at the end of the day, we're still looking at one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and it has a tremendous value. And climate issues are important, and we don't want to downplay that, but at the same time, you don't want to just write off that giant asset. And I think that's an important consideration as we move forward.
Yeah, I think you kind of started to answer my next question, which is how can we attract that investment? What are ways, the different levels of government and maybe different sectors or industries, what are things that they can do to try and, like you said, still take advantage of that huge asset?
Well, there are a few things. I think first of all, we need to be able to attract more private capital to Alberta. That's the key, and how you do that is the question. And a lot of banks, a lot of financial institutions are looking at ESG governance, ESG records, and how communicating Alberta's successes at ESG. Its ESG commitment and its the progress that it's made so far is key. Continuing to build on that success, especially from the environmental side, is key. So demonstrably lowering emissions, commitments to achieve net zero, support from the federal government, I think is a huge one. I think a lot of people in Alberta are frustrated because they don't see the federal government as providing a strong voice in support of its own energy and resources sector. So if the federal government were to say that we believe strongly and we stand behind our energy sector, we believe it has a future in a low carbon world, I think that alone would do a lot to attract investment to the province.
Yeah, I think that was one criticism Kenny had, is he wished that Trudeau and some of the federal people would have fought a little bit harder for projects like that. What would be your advice to the construction sector, which is, I think, has often been seen as kind of a dinosaur, slow to change and to adapt to new things? Do you think that they need to get more on board with, net zero and carbon capture and some of these new things that are coming into play?
That's a good question. I mean, to be honest, I don't know that much about how net zero plays into construction, other than a few of our members at BCA are looking at building on the residential side some net zero homes as demonstrations about what kinds of things, what they're capable of doing. I think in a sense, my sense is that a lot of the construction work is depending on activity in other industries for whom net zero is a much larger issue. So, any industry has an environmental footprint and can reduce it, but I think that the lion's share of that activity is in the industries that the construction sector is working in or towards. And so, I think about things like carbon capture type of projects. And so that's an area that the Alberta government and the federal government, I think, is going to be putting a fair bit of money into supporting the development of that, which is something that is useful and beneficial for creating a potential hydrogen economy at some point down the road. And I think that that will trigger demand for construction activity. And I don't think that the environmental record of the construction sector itself is going to be a deciding factor in some of those things.
Okay. And I think my last question, which is the $1 million question, what do you think is going to happen in 2021? What are maybe some of your predictions for Alberta's economy in the coming months?
Oh, that's it's the thing is, economists are guilty of being wrong all the time anyway. But, in times of COVID and economic shutdown and uncertain vaccine rollouts, we're going to be especially wrong. And I think there are a number of push and pull factors, especially if you think about it from the construction standpoint. And number one, which is not for construction, but for the entire economy, is that things really depend on vaccine rollout. And the quicker and more efficiently we can get over supply constraints and distribute vaccines and get people back to work, that's going to be the largest contributor to any economic recovery anywhere across the country. I mean, for construction, there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of push and pull things. I mean, there's still a number of projects that are underway. A lot of energy companies, if we just look at the energy component of it, have been deferring a lot of their capital and maintenance projects because they didn't have the money last year because of COVID. And so those projects need to get done. And so there will still be activity, maybe on not as much net new capital spending, but certainly on the maintenance and the maintenance side of things. Residential markets in the province are doing pretty well in the short term. I think if you look at construction permits, Residential, both single home, especially multi-home in the Calgary area, are quite strong, so that's a positive. There's a lot of weakness on the non-industrial side, or on the non-residential side rather, and I think that that's where the gap is, and that's the part that's going to be more concerning as we go forward.
Yeah, like you said, I guess a lot of it does depend on vaccine rollouts, and unfortunately, we are seeing, I think, a few delays here and there, and hopefully those don't continue.
Yeah, and attracting business investment is the other thing. This is a
Right.
problem that's been the case across Canada for the last 5 or 6 years. And as a share of GDP, business investment has been declining steadily over time. Independent of COVID, and changing and adapting and improving the regulatory process, the project approval process. That's instrumental to attracting the kinds of investment that's going to trigger this non-residential construction activity, because it's pretty tough to make the case to build something in Alberta or anywhere else in Canada when you can get your permits and get shovels in the ground 6 to 12 months earlier in the States for the same kind of project. And so that makes it difficult to attract investment. And I think that's something that in a longer term policy sense, we need to be taking a serious hard look at.
Well, hopefully 2021 brings better things.
Hopefully it does.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this week's podcast. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.